Marcus Blackwell slammed his penthouse door with the force of a man who just lost another $1 million deal. The sound echoed through the marble hallway of the luxury apartment building, a sharp punctuation mark to end another soul-crushing day. At 42, he'd built an empire from nothing, clawed his way to the top of the corporate food chain, and accumulated more wealth than most people could spend in 10 lifetimes. Yet tonight, like every night for the past 3 years, he felt hollow as an empty vault. The elevator descended to the parking garage in silence, its polished steel walls reflecting back a stranger he barely recognized, a sharp suit, sharper edges, and eyes that had forgotten how to smile. Success had cost him everything that mattered: his marriage, his relationship with his daughter, and somewhere along the way, his humanity. Now he lived alone in his glass tower, surrounded by expensive things that couldn't fill the emptiness gnawing at his chest. "Excuse me, mister?" The tiny voice caught him off guard as he stepped out of his black Tesla the next morning. Marcus looked down to find a little girl, no more than 7 years old, standing beside his car with a pink backpack that seemed too big for her small frame. Her dark hair was pulled into uneven pigtails, and her school uniform, a white shirt and navy jumper, looked like it had seen better days. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. They were bright and hopeful, completely untouched by the cynicism that had consumed his own. "What?" he snapped, his usual morning irritation already building. He had a board meeting in 30 minutes. And the last thing he needed was some kid delaying his schedule. The little girl didn't flinch at his harsh tone. Instead, she looked up at him with the kind of unwavering determination that reminded him of himself at her age, before the world had beaten the optimism out of him. "Will you walk me to school?" she asked simply. "My name's Emma. I live in 3B with my grandma, and she's in the hospital right now." The social worker said I could stay by myself for a few days, but I'm scared to walk to school alone. There's this big dog that barks at me from behind the fence on Maple Street, and yesterday some older kids were throwing rocks. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. This wasn't his problem. He didn't do charity cases, and he certainly didn't have time to play babysitter to some random kid. "Where are your parents?" Emma's face fell slightly, but she quickly recovered. "My mummy's in heaven, and I never met my daddy. But grandma says everything happens for a reason, and maybe the reason I met you is because you're supposed to help me." The words hit him like a physical blow. Everything happens for a reason. His ex-wife Sarah used to say that, back when he still believed in reasons and hope and second chances. Back before his relentless pursuit of success had driven away everyone who'd ever loved him. "Listen, kid," he said, his voice softer but still firm. "I'm not the helping type. Find someone else." He brushed past her, but her voice followed him to the building entrance. "Please, mister, I promise I won't be any trouble. I walk real fast, and I know all the shortcuts. It would only take 10 minutes. Marcus paused at the door, his hand on the handle. 10 minutes. In the grand scheme of his empire, 10 minutes was nothing. But those 10 minutes would mean everything to a scared little girl who'd already lost too much. Against every instinct screaming in his head, he turned around. "Fine, but just this once. And we leave in exactly 60 seconds, or I'm gone." Emma's face lit up like Christmas morning. "Really? Oh, thank you. Thank you. You're the nicest man in the whole world." Nicest man in the whole world. If she only knew the things he'd done to climb to the top, the people he'd stepped on, the corners he'd cut. But as they walked side by side down the quiet suburban street, something strange began to happen. The tension in his shoulders started to ease. The constant buzzing in his head of the endless stream of deals and deadlines and corporate warfare began to quiet. "What do you do for work?" Emma asked, skipping slightly to keep up with his long strides. "I run a company," he said curtly. "What kind of company?" "The kind that makes money." Emma pondered this seriously. "Do you like making money?" The question caught him off guard. Did he like it? He'd been chasing wealth for so long, he'd forgotten there was supposed to be enjoyment involved. "It's what I do." "That's not what I asked," Emma said with the brutal honesty that only children possessed. "My grandma always says we should do things that make our hearts happy." "Does making money make your heart happy?" Marcus found himself without an answer. They walked in comfortable silence until they reached the big dog behind the fence on Maple Street. It was a German Shepherd, and it did indeed bark ferociously as they approached. Marcus watched Emma's steps slow, saw her small hand reach instinctively toward his arm before she caught herself and pulled back. Without thinking, he moved closer to her, placing himself between the child and the fence. "It's just noise," he said quietly. "He's more scared than you are." Emma looked up at him with something approaching wonder. "How do you know that?" "Because I used to have a dog just like him, before." He caught himself before finishing the sentence. "Before Sarah left." Before his daughter stopped taking his calls. Before he'd chosen money over everything else that mattered. They reached the school just as the bell rang, and Emma turned to face him with those impossibly bright eyes. "Will you walk me tomorrow too?" Every rational part of his brain screamed number. He had meetings, conference calls, million-dollar decisions to make. But looking down at this little girl who'd somehow managed to crack something open inside his chest, he heard himself say, maybe turned into a week turned into a month. Every morning at 8:15, Marcus found himself standing beside his Tesla, waiting for a little girl with uneven pigtails and a smile that could light up downtown Manhattan. They developed routine as a stopping to pet the German Shepherd who turned out to be friendly once you got past the fence, buying hot chocolate from the vendor on the corner when it rained, racing each other to the crosswalk when they were running late. Emma told him about her grandmother, who'd raised her alone after her mother died in a car accident. She told him about her dreams of becoming a veterinarian so she could help animals like the German Shepherd who was just misunderstood. She told him about the kids at school who made fun of her thrift store clothes and second-hand books, and how she pretended it didn't matter even though it did. In return, Marcus found himself sharing pieces of his own story, how he'd grown up poor, sleeping 3 to a bed with his brothers in a rundown apartment not unlike the one Emma shared with her grandmother, how he'd worked 16-hour days to build his company from nothing, driven by a desperate need to never feel powerless again. How success had come at a price he was only now beginning to understand. The change didn't happen overnight. It started small. Marcus began arriving at the office 10 minutes later, but somehow his work didn't suffer. He found himself smiling at his assistant, asking about her weekend plans instead of just barking orders. He started seeing his employees as people rather than cogs in his money-making machine. But the real transformation came on a rainy Tuesday morning when Emma didn't appear at their usual meeting spot. Marcus waited 15 minutes, then 20, before taking the elevator to the 3rd floor. He knocked on apartment 3B. And when no one answered, he used his influence as the building owner to get the superintendent to open the door. The apartment was tiny but spotlessly clean, filled with the kind of love that money couldn't buy. Photos of Emma and an elderly woman covered every surface. their smiles radiating warmth throughout the small space. But Emma was nowhere to be found. A frantic call to the school revealed she hadn't shown up. Another call to the hospital where her grandmother was staying led to a devastating conversation with a social worker. Emma's grandmother had taken a turn for the worse. The little girl had spent the night in the hospital waiting room, refusing to leave her grandmother's side. By morning, she was emotionally and physically exhausted, curled up in a chair beside the woman who'd been her whole world. Marcus drove to the hospital faster than he'd driven anywhere in years, his usual concern for traffic laws abandoned. He found Emma in the pediatric waiting area, still in yesterday's school clothes, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "Emma," he said softly, and she looked up with such relief it nearly broke his heart. "Marcus, they won't let me see Grandma anymore. They said she's too sick for visitors, but I need to tell her I love her. What if she thinks I left her alone?" He sat beside her on the small plastic chair, this little girl who'd somehow become the most important person in his life. "She knows you love her. And she knows you didn't leave her alone. How can you be sure?" Marcus thought about all the times he'd chosen work over family, all the moments he'd missed because he was too busy building his empire. Because love doesn't need words to be real. She feels it every time you smile, every time you tell her about your day, every time you hug her goodnight. That love doesn't disappear just because there's a door between you. Emma leaned against his shoulder, and Marcus felt something shift inside his chest. For the first time in years, maybe decades, someone needed him for something that couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. This child trusted him, believed in him, saw something good in a man who'd forgotten he had any goodness left. "Will you stay with me?" Emma whispered. "As long as you need me," he promised, and meant it more than any contract he'd ever signed. They sat together through the afternoon and into the evening. Marcus made calls he'd never made before, cancelling meetings without rescheduling, telling his assistant he wouldn't be available, putting his empire on hold for something infinitely more valuable. When Emma finally fell asleep against his shoulder, he carefully lifted her small form and carried her to a more comfortable chair, then settled in beside her for what would be the longest night of his life. Emma's grandmother passed away just before dawn, slipping peacefully away while her granddaughter slept safely in Marcus's arms. When the social worker arrived to discuss Emma's future, Marcus already knew what he was going to do. The legal process took months, but Marcus had resources and determination that most people couldn't imagine. He hired the best family lawyers, underwent extensive background checks, and opened his life to scrutiny in ways that would have terrified him years earlier. Through it all, Emma stayed with him in the penthouse, slowly filling the cold spaces with laughter and warmth and the kind of chaos that comes with finger paints on expensive furniture and bedtime stories read in terrible cartoon voices. The morning Marcus officially became Emma's guardian, she stood beside his Tesla in her usual spot, but this time she was holding a small wrapped package. "What's this?" he asked, accepting the gift with the same gravity he'd once reserved for multi-million-dollar contracts. "Open it," Emma said, bouncing on her toes with excitement. Inside was a coffee mug, clearly homemade in an elementary school art class. It was painted bright yellow with uneven blue letters that spelled "World's Best Dad" in a child's careful handwriting. Marcus stared at the mug, his vision blurring as emotions he'd kept locked away for years finally broke free. He'd built a fortune, conquered markets, and wielded power that men twice his age envied. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had ever meant as much as this imperfect, beautiful gift from a little girl who saw past his greed and cynicism to find something worth loving. "Thank you," he whispered, pulling Emma into a hug that felt like coming home. As they walked towards school together, Emma's small hand in his, Marcus realized that Emma had been right all along. Everything did happen for a reason. He'd spent his whole life accumulating wealth he didn't need, chasing success that left him empty, building walls that kept everyone at a distance. But all of that had led him to this moment, to this extraordinary little girl who taught him the difference between having everything and having what mattered. The German shepherd wagged his tail as they passed, and the vendor on the corner waved cheerfully. Marcus waved back, marveling at how different the world looked when you remembered to see it through eyes unclouded by greed and fear. "Will you walk me to school tomorrow?" Emma asked as they reached the school gates, maintaining their morning tradition even though the question had become purely ceremonial. Marcus looked down at his daughter because that's what she was now, in every way that counted, and smiled with a warmth he thought he'd lost forever. "Every day," he promised. "For as long as you want me to." And for the first time in his life, Marcus Blackwell understood what it meant to be truly wealthy.